Hillary, it's all yours.
Thank you, everybody. And you're probably getting that pop-up about accepting our recording. And this is so folks can go back and listen to it at a later date. Thank you for joining us. I'm Hillary Knepper. I am a professor in the Department of Public Administration at Pace University in New York. And I am joined by my wonderful colleagues here. And we've got José Luis Irizarry, who is assistant professor at University of Illinois Springfield. We have got Seth Meyer, assistant professor at Bridgewater State University, and Michelle Evans, an assistant professor at University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. So we're covering a little bit of the area around, but sort of hovering in the Midwest to the Northeast, as you can tell, but we've got really some fun stuff to talk about here. And we are going to be sharing with you guys some really thoughtful perspectives and thoughts on intersectionality and social equity, and really looking at sports in public service. And so we're going to start with sort of Seth, your global perspective here, I think, and we'll go with your presentation, and then we'll have Michelle with her presentation. If it's okay with everybody, write down your questions. We'll let both of our presenters share their thoughts. They are not long. And then we'll get down to asking questions. I'll let you guys go first, or I can go first. It doesn't matter. We got lots of questions that'll bubble up. So thank you for joining us, everybody. We're happy to have you here. Seth, take it away.
Thank you so much, Hillary, as I try to figure out how to unmute myself on my new computer. So thank you, DSJ, for having me. My talk is called Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Sports Ball. Yay, home team. So I am an assistant professor at Bridgewater State University. And when I was getting this presentation ready, my husband was saying, please tell me you aren't using sports ball in the title. I was like, yes, I am. And I make jokes about it, but I am actually a very big hockey and MMA fan. And I always like to have my Islanders jersey out. So why are we talking about sports? We are public administration. Sports are a big part of public administration. If you haven't read Michael Blair Thomas's work, if you're interested, he's been doing a lot of work around bringing sports and a sports perspective into public administration. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about his work here. But cities are making branding and other agreements with professional teams. One of the big costs for cities are sports arenas. And coming from New York, we've got a lot of them. Athletes are also influential actors in public space, and they could help push across social equity. They can help limit social equity. And nonprofits are connected to sports both professionally and recreationally. Until very recently, the NFL was a giant nonprofit, but there are nonprofits which provide sports, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but there are nonprofit sports clubs, there are organizations that support people who do recreational sports. It's a part of public administration that we don't really talk about much, or really haven't even acknowledged that much. So it's really great that we are now considering sports in PA. So sports really is in all aspects of public administration. The government, we have relationships between government and sports clubs. How our government, I'm from Long Island originally, and if you know anything about hockey, you know that there was about a 20-year issue with the Islanders and Nassau County to build a new arena for the Islanders, probably about 10 years. So that, or you know that the Islanders and Rangers do not get along. And it was all about water rights. It was all about who's paying for this arena. It's about what would the arena be used for. It was about parking. All of these are part of public administration and have impacts on Nassau County, which is millions of people. There are also government-run sports programs. I have a almost 3-year-old son, believe it or not, and this summer he is going to be playing soccer at the through the local Parks and Recreation program. So sports are government-run. The police league also usually has sports. That's what I So when I was young. And there's regulation of sports. As I said before, I'm a mixed martial arts fan. And weigh-ins, health issues, all of that is through government regulations. And my gym is dealing with this right now, where we need to make sure that one of our fighters got all of their tests done, and there was issues with getting some tests done. That was all because of government regulations for, in this case, MMA. In nonprofits, we have sports clubs. We have organizations created around sports and the love of sports, and nonprofit advocacy for change in sports. And then, of course, from the individual, the micro perspective, people have identity around sports and sports clubs. Again, what do people know about me outside of academia? I'm an Islanders fan. It's a big identity. If, let's say, you grew up in upstate New York, you see the Sabres everywhere. I currently live in Boston, and it's one of the first questions I get asked when I mention I'm from New York is, what baseball team do you support? They're gauging to see if I'm a Yankees fan, which I am not. So yay, sports ball. Youth sports can be really central for children's physical and emotional growth. It's a really wonderful hobby for kids. It's a great way to get kids out. There's a lot of nonprofits as well that provide sports as a safe space for kids and mentoring opportunity. For adults, sports clubs can create a sense of community. It's wonderful. Everything's great, right? But sports can also be a weapon and a center for racism, homophobia, transphobia, white supremacy, etc. We have the racist sports mascots, such as the Kansas City Chiefs. This came up fairly recently when they were in the season finale of football, guest starring Rihanna. During the Super Bowl, that was a big conversation, is the tomahawk movements and just the name. There are also a lot of anti-trans legislations, which are around sports, and sports can actually be a recruitment for white supremacy. So what we're going to be going through next is a few of the ways that we can see sports is in public administration. I'm just going to highlight a few of them. So to start off, I have a chapter in a case study book that I co-edited with Richard Gregory Johnson, Lessons in Social Equity, a case study book. And what I did was I looked at a nonprofit based out of the United Kingdom, which I was also on the board of, that focused on making Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu welcoming. So this is a nonprofit that focused on Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And because BJJ is a sport that, depending on the gym, could be great, welcoming, like my gym, or it could be a very toxic environment. It was literally a sport created by fascists in Brazil. So yeah. And we created to provide guidance to gyms to explore how to be welcoming to everyone and how to create a welcoming gym. So this is the types of nonprofits that are really popping up that are interested in social equity, and we're of course not the only one. The Nazis and mixed martial arts. Mixed martial arts is an ever-growing sport. There are major leagues like UFC, Bellator. There's more small regional leagues. I go to what's called smokers quite a bit, which are amateur fights. A lot of my teammates have their first fight in these. And, mixed martial arts is very popular. MMA is a combination of sports. Wrestling, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Muay Thai, boxing. It's a variety of things that are used to come together to fight. The issue, though, is Nazis and white supremacists using MMA to recruit young people. You see this especially in certain states like Idaho, as well as internationally in countries like Russia. So when we really talk about mixed martial arts, we need to be aware of these currents and the conspiracy theories that really go around in MMA. And if you are ever a part of any of the chat boards, you can see a lot of QAnon conspiracy theories. You can see a lot of really this white supremacy. And being aware of that, because that white supremacy then leaks into the community. So these are tools, these are impacting our communities. And of course, the transgender, attacking transgender people through sports bans. I will tell you right now, my position is if you are not talking about transgender issues in your public administration classes and your programs, and you are, you are missing out on a very important topic that your students really need to be discussing. There is a gigantic rise in anti-transgender legislation around the countries, especially in states run by Republicans. Already in 2023, there were 359 anti-LGBTQ bills. 359. It's March. And there amongst them are bills to attack transgenders, individuals' ability just to play sports. And this is not just a giant thing. Sometimes these bills really just impact 4 people. Imagine creating a bill just to really limit 4 people from playing a sport. But just the bills in general have a negative impact on transgender youth health, well-being, even if they're not playing sports. It sends a message. Transgender individuals really are at the forefront right now of a lot of bills and a lot of legislative issues. And the sports bans, as well as bathroom bans, are really canaries in the coal mine. So that's part of why we care. Those sports impacts many different aspects of public administrations. We aren't having a conversation about, especially diversity, equity, inclusion. And sports can really be a great way to create a more inclusive environment. But it also is an avenue for hate and white supremacy. And we need to know how sports is affecting our culture and therefore our government and our organizations. So I really hope that our research agenda in the future will have a space for sports ball. So with that, I'm going to stop the share, and I look forward to, and Jose has thankfully put in my book, and I also want to put in, I have a new Substack newsletter that will be premiering tomorrow for the first time. So on LGBT, called the Queer Friendly Nonprofit, and how nonprofits can be more welcoming to LGBTQ people. So adding that in chat as well. Thank you.
Nice, Seth. Thank you very much. We appreciate that. And everybody, thanks, Heather and Jose. Appreciate the clapping sounds. And Michelle, you get set up, and then we will let you present, and then we'll move on to questions after that.
Okay. Hopefully everybody can see the single screen. Is that correct? Or did it? No, it flipped my display settings. There we go. How's that? Okay, well, thank you, Seth. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to go ahead and start by giving Jose and Hillary a little instruction to nudge me if I go over on time. I've tried to keep this relatively short because if you know me, A, I can talk, and B, I can really talk about sports. So I tried to keep it shorter to leave time for questions and answers. But wanted to go through and talk about some of the research that Hillary and I are actually doing right now. So some of it's based upon a paper that we've already sorted out. Some of it is based upon continuing research we're doing, where we're talking about sports running along this parallel path of social equity. So Seth touched on a little bit of this, and hopefully my chat will kind of follow up on some of those points as well. Because for me, I've long used sports within my classes as a way not just to illustrate these key public administration concepts, but also to help connect our concepts and show individuals that they're seeing public administration in their daily lives. They're seeing it when they watch movies. They're seeing it when they do things in their free time, like watch sports. And so we've got a few of the points that we have in our research. Hopefully I'm going to hit most of these points in the talk, but if somehow I overlook one of them, then I'm throwing it out to the audience to say, force me during Q&A to circle back and answer anything I may have missed. Because we've been looking, as I said, this parallel path, we've kind of been looking at legislation over the last 100 years. We've been looking at changes in sports, and particularly women's sports, over the last 100 years. And then we've been looking at changes for women within the public administration field to see that there really is this parallel in both advancement and obstacles that we see in all three avenues. Okay. Now I'm going to start the conversation on one of my favorite ways, focusing on the sport of women's basketball, and something that hopefully everybody's probably heard of lately, by highlighting Brittney Griner, who was one of the most talented and successful women basketball players today. And if she were on my favorite team, I'd probably be arguing one of the best basketball players ever, but she plays for the opponent, so I'm going to narrow that comment, right? She has a host of sports records, medals on the collegiate, the professional, the international level. She's got multiple gold medals representing the United States. And yet, these days, most people probably know her, at least in the broader society, based upon the news, based upon this intersection with public administration, with politics, with how we view individuals based upon our personal identities, based upon discrimination. And we know about her because of her recent incarceration in Russia for alleged attempts to smuggle cannabis vape cartridges before ultimately being released through a prisoner swap. And you can see the type of headlines that, despite being an American citizen, despite being this accomplished woman, despite being this role model to so many individuals, and despite the fact that we have her as our representative at the Olympics, we actually see opposition to people that wanted to free her. And largely this opposition revolved around these social equity concerns, these issues of identity, as you can see from the lovely little headline there, where some individuals put her identity as making her unworthy of receiving the same services that you or I might get if we were held in similar circumstances. And yet you have to ask, why the heck was she even over in Russia? Cue it back to social equity again. She was in Russia because of the massive, massive pay inequities that we see in US society, that are probably even more so in sports than we see in the general society. And so now I have two others, GOATs, so to speak, the greatest of all time. With, if you can, the slide is a little harder to read, but if you can see, they have similar stats, similar number of seasons in professional basketball leagues, the same number of national championships, both leaders and arguably the best players in their sport of all time. And yet Sue Bird makes an annual salary, and keep in mind, she's one of the top paid when she was playing, of $215,000 a year, while LeBron James' starting salary was $37 million and chump change, right? So Brittney Griner was forced to go try and play in Russia, putting her personal safety at risk, despite the fact that Russia is definitely not an inclusive society for people with her intersectional demographics. She was forced to go overseas because of this pay inequity. She can earn 4, 5, 6, 7 times the pay going over there. And if I continue on this theme, let's look at a few other ways that sports follows this kind of parallel path with some of our social equity concerns. And while Hillary's and my work is largely focusing on women's sports in our current research, this idea of advocacy and social change and these inequities do span across all different types of sports, as well as the entire gender spectrum, right? And so I've got a few different highlights, starting back with one that some of us of a certain age will recognize from 1968, the Black Power salute at the Olympics, and how this really probably put a huge halt to these athletes' career. They were not embraced, insert sarcasm here, they were not embraced by large portions of our society for having done this. We see more recently Colin Kaepernick, who took a knee in the NFL in order to highlight discrimination and social justice concerns. And he has essentially been forced out of the sport since taking a knee in silent protest. And yet we also see in the upper right there, we see Megan Rapinoe from our US women's soccer team doing the same thing, taking a knee, both to support Colin Kaepernick and what he was fighting for, but also to highlight other types of discrimination, say, that she has felt as a member of the LGBTQ plus population. Right. And so many of these early efforts, these highlights that we have, are really focused on the social equity aspects of, say, access, and kind of what I'm classifying under these range of phobias and discrimination. Sorry, it takes a little second to get this going. There we go. And yet, more recently, we also see a little bit of the shift to more of these social justice efforts. Highlighting, I've got the WNBA there that dedicated their 2020 season to social justice efforts, to protests, to highlighting prison, criminal justice reform, to highlighting the range of police shootings, such as Breonna Taylor, to the death of George Floyd. And we're really instrumental in bringing attention to these causes, and even getting involved in politics, being very instrumental in now Georgia Senator Warnock's campaign early on, when nobody knew who he was. And they were so successful in bringing attention to these issues that they actually forced out an owner in the league over, let's just say, anti-social justice perspectives. And yet in both of these women's works, we also see the parallel of intersectionality and privilege, where Megan Rapinoe is able to take a knee and remain in the sport, while her teammates of color were afraid to take a knee because they knew that they would likely be dropped from the team. So we also see even these efforts being, interwoven with these intersectional and privilege concerns as to who can speak up and who gets penalized more. Right. And then we also see some of these efforts moving beyond the access, the equity, the discrimination faced by the athletes themselves, out into society, into our public administration field, into our social norms. And we see it expanding in other areas, such as really a redefinition of parental rights, both maternity protections for athletes themselves. That shockingly still continues today, with players being dropped from sports if they get pregnant, not just going on hiatus, but being dropped completely from the sports, but also redefining these protections to give men benefits as fathers. And so they're reimagining who gets these types of benefits. They're broadening the attention to things like sex abuse, harassment by coaches, by owners, that who has the power in the league, a league of women, and now increasingly dealing with issues of gender identity and some of the trans issues that Seth was talking about. But a league that is focusing on one demographic that is largely being owned, and the rules created and the coaching done by men. So we're starting to see some of these changing norms. But even beyond that, as Seth kind of mentioned in some of his hat tip to the nonprofit participation, to these expanding protections, we see how sports can really change our understanding of individuals through simply the visibility and representation. And so I have another soccer photo down there of a professional soccer player in the NWSL here in the United States who has a physical deformity, and how people are now coming to the games and taking inspiration by the fact that she is willing to be open and honest about who she is, her limitations, her abilities. And so it's redefining what we mean about being disabled and shifting that more to enabled discussion in sports. But we also see the other roles that these nonprofits play. And this is where I feel like I'm in my lecture. I always manage to drop in Special Olympics at every opportunity, and how a nonprofit was able to transform the way we provide services for a population. In this case, for those with intellectual disabilities, through their individual program efforts. And so we see that sports is this huge social change force when we look at it. And and lastly, I'll just kind of, how am I doing on time? I'll highlight just a reminder on the social equity that even in sports, where we argue that it's supposed to be the most equal of equal playing fields, pun intended, right? Where it's not supposed to matter your gender, your race, your ethnicity, your religion. It's supposed to all be about what you can do in the athletic environment. And yet we still see these social equity issues in terms of access, process, quality, and outcomes that go not just to those demographics that I mentioned, the gender, race, ethnicity, disability, the intersectionalities thereof, but are also severely impacted by the socioeconomics. So it's built on these structural issues that go into it, that if you have certain financial abilities, you are going to have better access to being able to succeed in sports because you have better access to facilities. You have the ability for private coaches. You have perhaps a stay-at-home parent who's able to drive you to 19 different sports practices a week. And at this point, I'm probably hearing Seth go, yay, in the background when he thinks of that, right? So all these type of sports as this great kind of inclusive opportunity also highlights our structural issues that are in there. So just as we talk about those systemic and structural issues in public administration, we have to recognize how those things impact within sports as well. Perhaps it is a first-gen college student that doesn't even know that sports are available to them. If your family doesn't know, they can't prepare you for that. And then we also see not just legislative access, where it's kind of a two-step forward, one step back with Title IX opening the doors, but we see disparate impacts in Title IX that are impacting some races, some demographics more heavily than others. Some people have increased access, whereas others actually have decreased access. And we very much see, and this is the one I probably won't delve into much, I'll just give a real quick hat tip, to the social construction, similar to what I mentioned with Brittany Griner, the changing way we see athletes, the way we understand identities, the way we're debating gender identity, fights over pronouns and who has access. If you are trans, if you are binary, which sport and which team are you allowed to participate? And then Seth already talked about the nonprofits and the public government funding, and particularly the government funding is largely for male-focused sports, and very, very, very little goes towards women's sports, or at least outside of the avenue of, say, high school and college sports. It is, that you get a little bit more equity there, but in the professional arena, it's largely men's sports that are being highlighted. And so at this point, I'm going to just go ahead and stop and then try and save time for everybody to have some questions.
Thank you, Michelle. We appreciate that. And now we're going full screen. So if you've got questions, I have to do a shout out. Hey, Claire. Hey, Heather. Hey, Erin.
I'm sorry about that.
Good to see you guys. So I'm going to start with a question that was put in here by one of our panelists, and feel free to correct me. And guys, you can just, raise your hand and we'll call on you. I've got two questions in here. I'll start off with one just to get you guys going. So from one of our attendees, there's a lot in the critical gender, queer theory, and critical race literature about that winner take all versus scarcity mindset, where any gain by one is someone else's loss. And so the concern is that this drives a lot of the trans girls in high school sports debate, and seems to be in conflict with the idea that equality for women, people of color, and LGBT folks will help benefit all of us. And what Heather McGee calls the unity dividend. What do you all make of this conflict? Is it just rhetorical, or does it limit social equity efforts? So Seth, then Michelle, what do you guys think?
So I can take this from a queer theory perspective, because I am a queer theorist. I'm a queer theorist. I'm a very queer theorist. Queer theory would really question, why do we need gendered sports, especially a lot of sports that we have gendered? It really questions why. And if you look at the history of some of the gender divisions that we see in sports, some of it does come from women succeeding. And therefore, the attitude is, well, we need to separate them. And so queer theory would really even question, why do we need these separate sports? And of course, there are, I guess, with the winner take all mentality, do you more mean the disparate funding, or are we talking more about just kind of sports in general and kind of the win-lose mentality of sports?
I suspect it might be that, Seth, but it wasn't clarified.
Okay. So, I'm a competitive person. Michelle is laughing at me right now because she has seen it. I'm a fighter. And so my neighbors play softball. My neighbors' kids play softball. And I learned recently, and they're young, they're like 6, 7, they're too young to babysit my child, and that's all I know. They don't win or lose. And I was like, I don't know how I feel about this, because at the end of the day, learning to lose is actually really important. So part of it is, I think there's really something to be said about that. And I think it's great that we create spaces where everyone feels supported, and we create spaces where kids just want to have fun, because that really should be what sports should be about at that age, kids having fun. But I also do think that there's something to be said that we want kids to know how to lose, how to not, how to deal with not succeeding in a certain way, even though you tried hard. And it's not even just about who's better or who's worse. I've known fighters who have been amazing and had an off day. I've known fighters who have lost from just not being as good. I'm an Islanders fan. If you watch an Islanders season, you'll see them go really well. And then kind of and then way too late get better again. And that's sports. So I think that there's a way we can manage both. And I think that can be part of some of the critical theories, with queer theory, especially with critical race theory, and kind of building up, finding the racial structures that may create some of the barriers to success for kids in sports, and really exploring why are some kids pushed maybe to some sports than another. Or as we like to say in hockey, why is hockey so white? Who's pushed to there? Who's encouraged to play? So I hope that was maybe somewhat insightful.
Thanks, Seth. I appreciate it. And Michelle, I didn't know if you wanted to pick up on any of that as well in thinking about it, with that sort of that public administration winner take all, which, we're seeing this, we are seeing some of this.
Right. Actually, I was gonna share a sort of little anecdote, and then you all can sort of take out of it what you will as we go through. One of the reasons why I mentioned Special Olympics before is I spent most of my career working for Special Olympics. And if you're not aware, Special Olympics has designed its program so that every athlete during every competition has a reasonable chance of win. So we do what's called divisioning. We put them in groups of no more than 8 so that everybody has a chance on any given day, and we base it on their ability. So everybody who runs about a minute is going to be racing against other people who run about a minute, which is great when you're doing the 100-meter dash and you have 500 and all of them are running about the same. But you got those 10 athletes that are, somebody's running 2 minutes, somebody running 5 minutes, somebody's taking 10 minutes, and somebody's doing it 15 seconds. And so I'd end up doing my breakdown, and we'd have to do it by gender, girls competing against girls, guys competing against guys. And I'd end up with these athletes on the offset, and there'd be nobody for them to compete against. And it was just really disheartening to see them having to run by themselves and be handed a ribbon. And even with an intellectual disability, they know they're being dissed, that there's nobody to run against. And so I suggested this novel concept of, why don't we put the boys and girls together? They're being divisioned based upon their ability. Who cares what their gender is? Yeah. It's going to be a more fair thing. You would have thought I shot the Pope, right? They could not, no matter how I argued the case that it was better for the athletes, they'd have some, they could not get beyond their boundaries of what they were defining. And that was the way it went for 20 years in Special Olympics. And I'm betting that's how it exists today. It's hard to get people over those humps, even though I made a wonderfully logical argument, couldn't budge them.
So to you guys and to everybody else on this Zoom, what is the role of public administration in some of this? And particularly as we look at doors being closed, Claire, we're going to hold you personally responsible for Florida. Just saying.
Check my Facebook.
Kidding, guys. I'm originally from Florida. My family's all there. But in all seriousness, what is the role? And particularly, Seth, the numbers that you threw up at the beginning of your slides about the 359 anti-LGBTQ in its March in this year. So there is clearly a strong movement away from equity, away from talking about winner take all, making sure white people don't feel bad for the past. And we're seeing some real serious stuff that's going on around the country. So what is the role of public administration or public administration faculty in all of this? And particularly if you're in a state where you are having your ability to speak and teach constrained by the legislature. What do we do?
I'd like to say something. First of all, in defense of my state, go to my Facebook page. I posted an interesting about the evil one today. But I don't know if I realize that there were some aspects of public administration stretching this, but I think this is so much more of a societal lack of competitive world that we're in, that Seth referred to. In my former life that none of you know me in, when I was from time I was about 5 years old till my probably 30, I was originally a physical education major. I was a real jock. Now I'm 76, so imagine what it was for a female jock in the 50s, 60s. There were no opportunities that the gals have now. And we walk a fine line between several issues, wanting trans people to have the same opportunities to live, to be their truths in all actions, versus equity in terms of, listen, biologically, there is a muscular difference.
Yeah.
And then there's a difference that comes with money. Sports are revenue driven. That's why we lost our WNBA team here, because very few people were in attendance. They want to see the Heat play. So the major league teams are going to go with the teams that are going to bring in the revenue. If you're in a city that you're lucky enough to have a really supportive team, you know, it'll last. Same thing with having women get equitable pay. There is always the story that women don't play as well, people aren't as interested in women's sports, therefore it comes back to revenue. I know that when I played ball, I played as well as any boy in my block. But I know also as I got older, muscular things changed, and I didn't have the same training opportunities and the same training facilities. Our sports team didn't have the same opportunities. So there is some disparity. And even now, even though female sports have more training opportunities and they have certainly have more facilities than I did, it's still not the same as guys. So you're losing that. It's like saying somebody in PA goes to college and someone is just working as a clerk somewhere and expecting them to have the same breadth of knowledge. It's probably not going to happen. So there's an awful lot of differences that we could talk about that are probably a lot of them beyond the scope of public administration, except when it comes to the education focus.
Thanks,
It would-
Claire.
I'm sorry.
Did you want to take a stab at this one, Hillary? Or you want me to start off on this one?
Can I actually start off because I want to argue?
Okay.
This is a shock. I disagree with you, Claire,
That's okay.
on a variety of different things. But I think there's a big part of PA. I think that it's not just education, it's helping our students understand these disparities, that we can make a big difference, that we can start to ask, you know, there are these disparities in what training facilities are open to girls, boys, men, women. Why? And having these conversations are so important for all children's growth. So I think that there is a big space for PA to really fill in this area and really create the change where we're encouraging our students to really question, why are these differences? Why are there differences in the way that all of this is run? Why have we allowed it to be that way? And as local governments, as state and federal governments, and I think that having those conversations can really open up ways that PA can create research that can be used to show that everyone deserves adequate spaces in sports. So I think that there is a really great place for PA, and I think that this could be a really strong movement, really, for it. So.
Can I just respond to you? I agree in theory with what you're saying, which PA is so based on. This is my practitioner side talking. But when you talk about access to resources and everything, it all comes back to the money, because who puts the money in for these training centers? It's not local government. It's not even state or federal government. It's people, we down here in Florida, Auto Nation donates tremendous amount of money to training facilities. You have Alex Rodriguez donated a boatload of money to the University of Miami for their baseball program. Not the softball program, the baseball program. So those are the things that I said, what I meant when I said a lot of this is out of our control. I do also, I was interested in what you were talking about winning. And Michelle was also referencing it also. And we've, winning is realistic. People want to win. Competitive things, you know, are real. And I think that we have to find lanes that we can have both, because it's just like when you have a game that's out of one team is winning by 50 points on a football field, say, and you put in your third stringers, you can't tell them don't run up the score. They have to, because that's, first of all, that's how they learn and that's how they improve. And that's the way the sports are. So we get there's just a whole bunch of stuff, and I just don't think it's that clear cut. You know, winning isn't everything, but yeah, it is. and it's finding the balance, I think, where that there are places for people for everybody to win something, but that there also has to be a room for that competitive nature that's not being siphoned off from us.
Thanks, Claire. And Michelle, and then.
Yeah, let me just do a
Jose.
real quick point, and then we'll open it up to another question. But I totally get what you're saying about the finances, Claire, right? It is an absolutely logical argument that we deal with, particularly in anything other than men's sports, but sometimes even in those men's sports like a lacrosse or even sometimes hockey, where, you know, they're not as big or as profitable as football. But the connection for me to public administration is understanding why we have those disparities and the finances, that it's not based upon the financing at this moment. It's based upon the last 200 years of structural financing that has set the stage for men in this regard and hasn't done that for women in that regard. And so it's not just the funding that we have today, it's recognizing that it's all this funding. And so to me, that's exactly why public administration has to have a role in this. They have to look at the fact that we regulate television stations. For politicians, we say during election season, if you give time to one party, you have to give time to the other party. These ideas are infused with public administration and their efforts to help even that playing field, so to speak, that if things are built on these structural issues, then they need to go in and actually intentionally bump up the funding until everybody else has that opportunity as well. At that point, then we can say, hey, we'll just go with, you know, who's getting involved and how many tickets are we selling. But we have to recognize the role that public administration had in getting us to that point today. And therefore, in my opinion, it's part of our responsibility to acknowledge that and intentionally incorporate that going forward.
Thanks, Michelle. And I think, Jose, you wanted a quick comment?
Yeah, now it's just not so quick anymore. Thank you. Showing up. I have to thank you, Nuri, for joining us. He has to run. I just have to note, I mean, Claire and Michelle commented on some of the stuff I wanted to bring up about why this is important in public service. In the chat, I put this comment in. This is a space we should be creating as public leaders where we could have disagreements. We could, you know, laugh and joke and still find a way to move the conversation forward in the ultimate goal that I think we all share, which is to foster and enhance social equity in public service so that we can actually foster the public interest, whatever that interest may be. In this particular conversation, it's sports and public service, but it goes beyond that. So, you know, to that end, I wanted to add that, you know, human beings are ingenious. I understand Claire's perspective. I've learned much from her over the years. I'm blessed to have at least 4 different mentors, you know, including Claire and Hillary and Seth and Michelle on here that I have learned so much from, right? And Wally's here too. And then there's Vanessa, Nuri just left. There's Heather. I mean, I've learned so much from you guys. I don't hold the same views. And not always, but we still find a way to move forward. And so I don't think we're limited by what we've done in the past. We have the power to change what we do going forward, period. And this is true in government, where, as I think Michelle noted, we have regulations and we can use those mechanisms. We have funding mechanisms, right? Think of parks and recreations, local government departments. Growing up in New York City, it was the Little Van Cortlandt Park Association that worked with government to, you know, create summer stuff for us to keep us off the streets and out of crime. Right? We learned sports, we did arts and crafts, et cetera, et cetera. There's also a role to play in the nonprofit sector. Many nonprofits, as Seth had mentioned previously, I mean, they're the center of the community, literally community centers. You could look at places like the YMCA. They have sports activities and they may be involved in more, you know, professional and organized, formal, you know, sporting events for our children. That's another area where we have a lot of room. And I would love for you guys to talk to Michelle further about how she worked with the Special Olympics to kind of foster this from that angle. It is fascinating. And then, of course, there's always the private sector. I mean, in the volunteer world, you know, working in the nonprofit sector, working with corporate volunteers, I also learned they have sports teams. You know what? That's another way. So even the private sector can help us foster social equity in sports and of course in civil society. So that said, I end with, you know, not just as public service leaders, but as citizens of this, you know, democratic society, we're not limited by what we've done in the past. And we can use our ingenuity to find ways, you know, that work going forward. That's all I had to say. Thank you.
Love that, Jose. Thank you very much. And I appreciate all the back and forth on this. And if it's okay with one last question, why don't we take it international? And let's look at international sports. So one question that we've got from our attendees is, how can we ensure that sports programs in developing countries like the Gambia, for example, are culturally sensitive and take into consideration local traditions and practices while also promoting social justice and equity? And this question is being asked because our questioner has said that on several occasions they've seen women and girls who are active in sports are often profiled as men. Any thoughts on that? Which is clearly a really interesting question. I would say, in addition to internationally, we've got our own folks here in the United States, but that have some similar challenges with the communities in which they're living. But let's take it international, because many of our sports are international. And Michelle, you started off with that, with talking about some of the impacts of women's basketball.
Right. Well, that is, we would need like another 3 hours to properly address. That's a terrific question, right? How do you honor local customs and local norms on that international stage when our norms may be very different? And how do we create that shared space? And that one is, you know, I don't have an answer for that. That's a challenging one. We see how sports is able to help us try and change some of those norms, to try and find accommodations. Maybe it's changing sports rules to accommodate what uniforms and attire is allowed within the rules in order to accommodate certain religions, certain cultures, and recognizing that. But that is a challenging question, right? And that is very much of a power dynamic in terms of who really has the biggest power in those debates. It's not necessarily, I think you mentioned Gambia, is that the nation? Right? That conversation is probably largely going to be driven by international governing bodies that are going to be dominated by the US, by European nations, that may be dominated by patriarchal and traditional cultures that may have very different viewpoints. So it is this challenging balancing act to try and respect and change while also, you know, moving forward and changing this. So it's a very slow process in many ways, but to some extent, that's how, in particular, the women's sports has been helpful. And this is a case of the US is rather privileged in terms of sports. We have dominated on the sports stage, probably more significantly, or at least over a longer time frame than many nations. And so many nations are able to use the US as their guide to try and shift the balance in their own nations, see what's worked from the safety of the US and try and implement it in maybe small pieces in their country as they go forward. But it's a really challenging situation. Mm-hmm.
And so I'm going to be Jewish, you know, I'm Jewish and it's a Jewish holiday, so I'm going to tell a story. When I was a consultant at a nonprofit in South Africa, an American had come to them and they had sent him over to me. He was a basketball player, not a big one, no, not a big name. And he'd come to South Africa to start a nonprofit where he was going to build basketball courts in the informal settlements. And he'd gotten money for this from America to build this in South Africa. And we were talking, and my first question was, why? You know, basketball, my feelings about basketball, plus or negative aside, if you look at a basketball court, it's good for basketball. They have all the, they want to build them on green fields. If you have a green field, then you can play rugby. You can play football, or as we call it here, soccer. You can play cricket. Theoretically, I still don't understand that.
Hockey.
I still don't understand it. But, this field can be used for so many things. And the community would be so excited if we cleaned it up and got it ready for a soccer field. But this was an organization that wasn't talking with the community. It was an organization that decided, we play basketball here in America. We want to transfer basketball. It wasn't asking,
Right.
what can we do for the community to create spaces? And he talked about building up all these leagues and everything. I was like, does anyone want that?
Yeah.
I asked, is that going to be supported by the community? Because you can go into another country and create a nonprofit and leave. They're the community is the ones that are going to have to keep it up. That's going to have to keep up the basketball court. That's going to have to keep up the leagues, the fees for all the fat sports fashion that people wear, also called jerseys. So it was such a surprise to him to really think about that. But I think that connects a lot to this, where there is a question of how do we decolonize sports? How do we create a sports perspective that isn't, this is what we do in these countries, therefore we need to transport it to other countries? But instead, how can we create a local sports program that is supportive of those communities? And it's going to be different in every country, but really creating that bottom up, perspective, I think creates is the beginning of that dialogue.
And that's again where public administration comes back in and loops around. And Seth, with your creating these spaces, these thoughtful spaces and delivering what the community needs, a big thank you to Vanessa and DSJ and ASPA for creating this space for us. And we appreciate, Claire loved the discussions that we had generated with you here, and everybody, it was really great experience. Sorry, ran just a little bit over, but thank you so much for joining us. And we'll look forward to seeing you in other safe, interesting spaces where we can continue these dialogues. And thank you so much, and we'll talk to you soon.
It was great seeing all your faces. It's been forever.
It is great seeing you.
Thank you,
all
everyone.
for coming.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, Jose.